Okay, so today we begin preparing for Pesach, and we never finish. Pesach is the day that scares most ladies. They don't like to even talk about it. Right? So tonight we're not going to talk about it. That's the good news. Right? What are we going to talk about? When we learn halacha, it's important. There's a mystery about halacha. Where does it come from? I don't see it in the Torah. How do we end up with it? And what am I supposed to know about halacha? Right? So I thought we would make an effort this one time to demystify the process of halacha.
Yeah, who said it?
How it comes to us from Har Sinai to cleaning for Pesach. How did that happen? Right? Because if you look in the Chumash about Pesach, you won't have any leaven in your house, you won't own any. That's pretty well it. For 7 days you'll eat matzah. That's it. Where did the craziness come from? Right? What's it about, and what's its significance? Right? And what we're going to learn today applies to all halachas. Right? Number one. Number two is women have a somewhat controversial position about learning Torah Baal Peh, the oral Torah. Right? And I want to clarify it today, what the rules of this are. Right? Not only is there no prohibition against women learning the oral Torah,
Talmud, yeah?
learning the oral Torah, but in fact it's a requirement that women learn halachas that specifically they have to live. The kashrus of my home, of myself, my son, is dependent on my wife knowing the laws of kashrus. Absolutely required. Right? Also true of laws of family purity. Also true of laws of Shabbos. Right? Very important. Right? How is she supposed to know it? It's a good question. How is she supposed to know it? She's supposed to know it because she's supposed to learn it. It's a requirement to learn it. Right?
Because if you're looking back on Adam and Chava, we know what happened.
That's another conversation. Men have an additional responsibility in learning, which doesn't apply in this room as much, but Pesach certainly it applies to for the ladies. Men have a requirement simply to learn for the sake of learning, right? Not because it improves your ability to do a mitzvah. Other reasons why women learn is it improves their yiras shamayim, their fear of God, and their love of God. You know, if you understand what God wants from us, it's much easier to do that and to have the relationship with God. Halachas are part of the relationship with God. Leib Kelman, Lawrence Kelman, I once was listening to a tape of his, and he was speaking to a group of ladies, and he said, I'm going to tell you about the most significant Kabbalistic work that exists. Right? This work, right, is available in English. It's available in English, right? And you can buy it in virtually any Jewish bookstore. So that's strange because we don't think of Kabbalistic works that way. He said it's called the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. So the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, isn't usually thought of as a Kabbalistic work. But in fact, think this way. When I was young, when I was sort of 10, 11 years old, I learned how to dance with ladies. You know, waltz, foxtrot, cha-cha, all those kind of things, right? You know, this is before I was not dancing with other ladies, right? And I wore white gloves and a little tie and a little black suit, right? And we would go to the ladies' side and ask them, will you dance, right? And then the key to it was not to step on their feet. This is a big problem when you're learning to dance, is you don't want to step on your partner's feet. Right? That's what the Shulchan Aruch is. When we learn to dance, we learn 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you have somebody telling you 1, 2, 3, 4, right? The Shulchan Aruch is the dance with God. And you shouldn't step on his feet. It's very important. Halachas are about our relationship with God. They're not just simply rules. Right? they manifest themselves as rules, right? So I say to you, you should light candles by a certain time, right? But you should understand that you just should understand that the nature of halacha is divine. It's not like a law that tells you not to jaywalk. For that reason, I want to now look and see how we come to the process. Okay? So, I'm going to pass out these. This is from a book that I don't have here. Where is it? Did I put it here? No, I'm going to put it here. I'll show it to you later. I know you want the book. Here you go. You pass that to my wife. Hello. How's it going? Good. Good. Okay, so where does halacha come from? We're going to look here before we start into Pirkei Avos, right? Pirkei Avos translates roughly as the sayings of the fathers. They're little statements that tell us how the great rabbis of the past used to live. But it begins with the following statement. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai.
Where are you?
It's not there. Just listen. I'm here. Right? Moshe received the Torah from Sinai and passed it on to Joshua. Joshua to the elders to the prophets passed it on to the men of the great assembly. They said three things. Be patient in judgment, raise many disciples, and make a protective fence around the Torah. That's the first sayings of the fathers. The next one, Shimon HaTzadik, the righteous one, was from the last of the men of the great assembly, and he would say, the world stands on three things: Torah worship and deeds of kindness. Antigonus, the man of Socho, received from Shimon the Tzaddik. He would say, do not be like the servants who serve the master in order to receive a reward. Rather be like the servants who serve the master not in order to receive a reward, and let the awe of God be with you. And it continues. It talks about who he passed it on to, and who he passed it on to, and it goes on. So that's how we know.
Yeah.
Sorry. What is the human factor? What is the stop between the God give information and a human factor to
Do they add something?
add something?
They had nothing. They had nothing at the beginning. We're going to now deal with that, right?
This is what you meant. What is a human factor in
Right.
transmission?
So, and by the way, interestingly, note something, that it doesn't say Moshe received the Torah from God.
It's done.
It says he received it from Sinai. Right? Remember? It said he received it from Sinai.
From God.
Right. Curious statement, right? A mountain gave it to him. So we understand.
Who gave him?
Chazal explained, and by the way, these are all Mishnahs that I just read. Pirkei Avos is a Mishnah, and I'm going to explain where a Mishnah comes into the chain in a second. We're going to learn the chain, how it goes from there to cleaning for Pesach tonight. So Chazal tell us that the meaning of this was that Moshe and Sinai shared something in common. Does anybody know what they shared in common?
Moshe
And Har Sinai.
Moshe, a modesty?
not modesty.
Humility.
Humility.
Right? The Torah was given in the middle of the Midbar, in the middle of the wilderness, right? On Mount Sinai. We're told that all the mountains wanted the privilege of being the place where God would come, right? And the one that got the privilege was the smallest of all mountains. If you ever see the real Har Sinai, you see it's just a hill. It's not even a mountain. It's just a fairly big hill. It's hard to even call it a mountain. When Moses was born, it doesn't tell us who his father and mother were. Right? It says that he was born of a man from the tribe of Levi and a woman from the tribe of Levi. It doesn't say Amram and Yocheved. It says that later in the next chapter. And we understand the reason for this is, unlike Rabbi Akiva, who we'll come to learn about tonight as well, Moshe Rabbeinu was from the sixth day of creation planned by God as an individual who would be, I use this word reluctantly, but it's the only one I can use here, who would be a perfect channel for the Word of God. That is to say, Moshe would not add his own emotions, his own thoughts, his own ideas to it. What God said to him, he would say exactly as it was said to him. Not add anything, not subtract anything. So that when it came to, especially, the Torah B'Ksav, the written Torah that we have, the 5 books of Moses, right? Those are word for word, verbatim, the dictation that Moshe took from God on Mount Sinai. Right? And he didn't add anything of himself. Right? He was nameless, so to speak, in this process. Right? And he was chosen. You know, I have a good friend, he's a filmmaker, and he once said to me something. He said, God had to choose the humblest of all people for this task. Why? Because anybody else would have thought they were a God themselves after this experience. Right? You know, think about the world they lived in. Right? Anybody else would say, I've come face to face with the creator of the universe, and I've lived. Right? And who am I? I am a God too that can do this. Right? So God chose the humblest of all men. That's what the Torah tells us about Moshe. That was his quality on the humblest of all mountains.
It means, what does it mean to be humble? It means that you don't consider yourself important enough to add something to the topic. You pass. What is a humble?
No, Moshe understood that his task was to relay the word of God to the Jewish people, and not to add to it specifically. He did not create a. You know the story, but we'll come to the story about Rabbi Akiva later, and I'll explain later that he had a very different approach than Rabbi Akiva had to the Torah. Rabbi Akiva is kind of the Moshe of the oral Torah, really, but he's a very different kind of individual, and we'll see more about it later. Let's look at this document here, okay? So let me just introduce what the document is. There was an author who lived at the end of the 19th century, 1800s, in Lithuania, and he's called the Chai Adam. And he wrote a compendium of Jewish law prior to the writing of the Shulchan Aruch. The author of this introduction to his work wrote a translation of the Chai Adam on Hanukkah and Megillah. Chai Adam was very brilliant and very lofty.
This is a rabbi who was so last.
Yeah, David Lewin.
Oh.
David Lewin. Yeah. What I like most about the book is actually the introduction, where he lays out very clearly. This is actually what I'm teaching tonight is something that you could easily spend, 3 or 4 months learning, and it would be lots of fun. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to learn it in a compressed way. And this, I feel, is the best compressed way to do it, and answer some questions as we go. So
this author of this book is Chai Adam.
Chai Adam, yeah. Chai Adam on Purim and Hanukkah. Chai Adam wrote on everything, like a Kitzer, right, like a Shulchan Aruch, right? But this is a forward to a book of the Chai Adam just on these 2 things, on Megillah Esther on Purim, and on Hanukkah, right? So when he refers to the goal of this work, he's talking about the book, right? But for our purposes, it applies to the halachic process, okay? Much of the goal of this work is to dispel, this is from the Chai Adam translation, let me be formal about it, of the laws of Megillah and Hanukkah by Rabbi David Lewin. Much of the goal of this work is to dispel the misconception that halacha, Jewish law, is nothing more than a set of dry rules and regulations. Nothing could be further from the truth. Almost every halacha in the Shulchan Aruch is surrounded by much discussion and debate. Virtually every one of them is a product of the halachic process rooted in the Talmud. In order to gain a greater appreciation of halacha, it's imperative that one understands how this works. The following pages are intended to explain just that. Then all Jewish books begin like this. And please be aware that what you are about to read is in no way exhaustive and is oversimplified and incomplete. The intention is to give the reader a basic lesson in the evolution of halacha and the understanding that there is far more to halacha than meets the eye. What you need to keep in mind as we're learning this is the idea of halacha is to connect you, me, you, anybody who's learning it, to Moshe Rabbeinu and the revelation at Sinai. That's actually what it's about. And it's a very important thing to understand this. So that if you take all the books in here and read them all, right, on your own, right, you will become very knowledgeable about Jewish law. No question about it, right? But you won't have that connection to the chain. The requirement of the connection of the chain is to learn from somebody else who has learned from somebody else. That is the unbroken chain. Right? And you'll see that the authors of Jewish works wrote that with that in mind. They intentionally made it that you needed to have a teacher.
What word Mesorah actually means?
Mesorah is the handing down.
It's a transition. What is Mesorah?
It's
Hebrew
pass.
speakers. To pass.
To
What
pass
is
over.
the difference between Kabbalah, Mikabel, and it's a
To receive. To receive. To receive.
Mesorah, it's a
Right.
pass.
On Har Sinai...
But she asked a question before.
Yeah, we're going to get to the answer to
And the
it.
question is human factor.
Yeah, we're going to get to it.
The broken telephone.
We're going to get to it, I promise you. I promise you. On Har Sinai, Hashem gave the Jewish people two Torahs. Very important. The written Torah, which are the 5 books as we know them, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, which accompanied it. The two are inseparable, and the written Torah cannot function without the oral Torah that accompanies it. For example, the Torah tells us to put totafos on our heads, but without the Torah Sheba'al Peh, we do not know what this refers to, and that it refers to tefillin, nor do we know how to make them. The Torah commands us not to do malacha on Shabbos. Right? We translate that as work, right? But it is only the oral law that tells us what malacha is. We don't know what malacha is. We hear this from the Torah. To use a metaphor, at the end of tonight, if you have a friend who says to you, well, what did Rabbi Ostriker talk about? Can I see your notes? Right? So you would show your friend your notes, right? Your notes are meaningful to you. Right? They wouldn't be that meaningful to your friend, right? Unless you explained it, right? So what the Torah, the 5 books of Moses are, right? The Chumash is, Sefer Torah is the dictation of what God said to write down, right? The oral law are the notes that Moshe took at the same time for his own sake. Well, he didn't write it down, but he remembered it because he was very smart, right? But it's the explanation. Sometimes it's things that aren't even in the Chumash at all, and sometimes it's more detailed explanations and clarity of what's in it. Right? It has the same merit as the Torah, as the written Torah. Right? The Torah commanded that the oral law remain that way and not be written down. Although HaKadosh Baruch Hu had many reasons why it should be this way, one effect was to necessitate an ongoing relationship, ultimately, between the Rebbe and the Talmud, between the student and the teacher, ultimately a constant connection all the way back to Har Sinai. It should be noted, however, that Talmidim often did keep notes. Rambam writes about this in detail, that even though it was the oral Torah, they took very detailed notes of what they were learning from their teacher, right? But it was never published in any form. Things remained that way until the times of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, a little over 2,000 years ago. For 1,000 years, the oral Torah was handed down, word by word, from teacher to student. And now we'll deal with your question, right? So how was it done, right? It was done as a song. You know, it's much easier to remember a song than it is to remember a paragraph, I think. I think everybody would agree with that, right? When you learn a song, you learn the words, you remember the words. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what language it is, you learn it, right? But if you tell somebody a paragraph of the content of that song, it's very unlikely that they'll get the words wrong when they're telling it over again. Slightly wrong. The song, usually you get all the words right over and over and over.
Sometimes they do la 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 when they don't remember the word.
So, and they did too, right? So my son pointed out to me when he was learning Mishnah, he said, not only is it a song, but sometimes they will drop a syllable or add a syllable to make it work as a song, right? Am I right?
No,
in the Mishnah. What?
I'm listening.
Yeah, okay. He'll correct me if I'm wrong. Right? So that's how it was handed down, right? And it would be handed down by the Rebbe would sing the song, and the students would sing it back to him, right? After that, they would have a long time where they would explain the significance of it. This was the Mishnah, the original oral Torah, right? And it never had to be written down because the song was clear. Moshe had taught it to Joshua, Joshua taught it to the elder passed it on as the song, right? You know, whatever the national anthem of a country is, people know the words to that national anthem, everybody knows it for generation to generation. It doesn't change, right? So it is with, favorite songs. Things remained this way until the time of Yehuda Hanasi, a little over 2,000 years ago, when he feared that the Jewish people went into Golas, exile. The tradition would be lost. I just want to take a moment to back up for a second. Because when people say, what do you mean Moshe received the Talmud, the oral law, on Har Sinai? Right? There's a discussion that says by Chazal that the day after Har Sinai, the Jews were already having the arguments of Rav and Abaye. Rav and Abaye wouldn't live for another 2,500 years later, right? 1,500 years later. How could they be having these discussions? When we read the Talmud, when we read the Mishnah, right, we think we're reading the words of Rav and Abaye, right? And indeed we are. But they were actually the last ones to say these words before it got written down. They weren't the first ones to say it. It was said way back, at the very earliest days, right? So these discussions that are written down and credited to individual great Ravs, great Rebbeim, right? It doesn't mean that they originated the concept. It means that they were the last ones to give it over before the book was finished. Right?
Closed.
Before the book was finished, right? Now, one thing to note, there are different periods in history, right, where we have, they are natural ending times of generations, right? The generations recognize we cannot comment on the previous generation's work because we're further away from Sinai and we've lost some of the clarity on it. So we can work to understand what they said, but we really can't contradict it because we don't have that knowledge to do it. My wife will pardon me, and maybe Galia will as well, but there's a story that is worth repeating to understand this. There were two very great rabbis that lived in New York in the last century. They died, I think, in the 1980s, late 80s. One was Reb Moshe Feinstein. He's quite well known as the Pesach of the generation, the decisor of the generation. And the other was Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was a very, very gentle and sweet man, and he was kind of the comfort of the generation as well. Reb Yaakov was once on a flight to Israel. Do you know the story? If you know the story, tell me. He was once on a flight to Israel, and with him was one of his grandchildren. Right? And on the other side of the aisle was a person about his age. They were both in their 80s at this point, who was a professor of, I think, some biology science. I think it was nuclear biology, but I'm not sure. And throughout the flight, the grandson is nonstop taking care of his Zadie. You should have some more water. Do you want a blanket? Can I get another pillow? You know, you shouldn't eat this. You should eat that. I'll speak to the flight attendant. I'll take care of you. To the point where the neighbor is kind of a little bit irritated. You know, what's going on here? And he said to him, he said, you know, this must be your special, you know, you have one grandchild. I have some, you know, whatever, 37 grandchildren. You had a big family. He said, they had a lottery as to who would fly with me to Israel, right, and take care of me. They all wanted. And the professor said, I don't understand. When I am with my grandchildren, they want to know what gifts I bring them from far away. They don't do this. You know, when I get to Israel, there'll be a limousine that will come and meet me and take me, right? Nobody's going to, the family. How could it be? Rabbi Yaakov said, with all due respect, your science has taught for a long time, evolution, that we're descended from monkeys. So your grandchildren are 2 generations further developed away from the monkeys than you are. So they may respect you as a grandfather and as a professor who has a lot of knowledge, but they know that they're far more refined than you are because they're 2 generations away from a gorilla than you are. Right? We say that the high point of history was Har Sinai. This was the moment when the creator of the universe, the Almighty, actually had direct contact with the nation of Israel. Not with one person, not with one prophet, but the water carriers, the wood choppers, all witnessed God at that moment. Right? For my grandchildren, I'm 2 generations closer to that moment. They hold that moment as the center of history. I'm not 2 generations closer to a monkey. I'm 2 generations closer to Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why they treat me this way. That's the only reason. Right? This is a very important idea to have, because that's what our goal is throughout this process, is to make sure what we're getting is coming through that route. The way that it was kept as straightforward as possible was through very short songs, almost like haiku, right? I'll give you, I mean, even these things are like that. They're very short, right? The world stands on 3 things, you know. Maybe the most famous one, actually, you're probably familiar with. Manish tana halayla hazeh mikol halaylos. Right? You know, that's the song of the Mishnah. Right? Pardon my voice, I'm not a great singer, but that is the tune. Right? And this is how it was passed on. But when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed... Oh, actually, let me just come back one other point. As people were learning the Mishnahs, they were learning from their chain of Rebbeim, right? So, for instance, right, the Mishnah itself is so short that really what it is like a bullet, like a list of, you know, the expression bullets when you say for a list of to-do list,
like
right?
a plan, you know, like
a to-do list.
Okay,
to-do list, right? So, for instance, today is Sunday, right? It's the one day we're not working. It's one day we're not in shul, right? All day long, right? So many people have a to-do list for today. All the things you have to get done. Do you have a to-do list for today? No? I do.
For the next week?
I do. No, for Sunday. But for next week, okay. I do, right? So my to-do list, it looks like this. Gas station, bank machine, dry cleaner, stop by at Aish, right? Library. That's what it says, right? It doesn't say what I should do when I get to the gas station. It doesn't say that. It just says gas station. That's what the Mishnah is. Now, when I teach my son, if you're going on a trip and you go to the gas station, fill it up with gas, check all the fluids, windshield wiper, right, tires, before you go on a long trip. You got to do that, right? Galia might tell her son something slightly different, you know? See if the wiper blades are clean, right? Make sure that whatever, this is done, that's done, right? But we all said go to the gas station, and we all knew fill up the car with gas, right? We all knew that, right? The Mishnah that was being taught was go to the gas station, fill your car up with gas. But each Tana, each master, would add, check the tires, do the oil, right? That would be his thing, right? For 1,000 years, there was no machloket. There was no difference in the understanding of the Mishnah. Everybody understood the Mishnah exactly as it had been given.
For 1,000 years.
For 1,000 years.
Till Second Temple or till...
At the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jews were going to go into Galus, and it was going to be a very long exile.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a fear that it would turn into broken telephone. Would turn into broken telephone. There were already major discussions that had gone on at the time of the first destruction, when the Jews created the yeshivas in Babel. Because what happened? My son and Galia's son were both in the same yeshiva together.
Mm-hmm.
And my son said, when you go to the gas station, it's very important, first you do the liquids, then you do the tires, right? And her son said, no, that's wrong. You fill it up with gas, then you check the tires, and then you... So now the two of them believe 100%, because our Rabbi told us to do it this way, right? That's what everyone goes to the gas station. Everybody says put the gas in the car. But there were small differences, right? So what had to happen, and this happened in Babel when the first exile happened, they began the process of reconciling these differences. Okay? But keep in mind, when you read a Mishnah, it will be not terribly meaningful to you, because it's intended to be incomplete. It's intended to leave gaps, because if it was complete, then you don't need the Rebbe, and you don't have the connection back to Har Sinai. So, look what it says. Things remained this way until the times of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, a little over 2,000 years ago. He lived at the time of destruction, when he feared that as the Jewish people went into Galus, the tradition would be lost, invoking the edict of Esla Asos L'Shem Heferenu Torsecha, that in a time of necessity, certain halachas may be temporarily suspended in order to preserve the Torah and its observance. This is something that is very rarely done in our history. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi made the decision to commit the Torah Shel Baal Peh to writing and organize the Mishnahs, the Mishnayos, plural of Mishnah, as we have them today. In doing so, he attempted to maintain the oral elements of the law as much as possible, and therefore much of the Mishnayos were purposely left cryptic to appear to be incomplete. In this way, he was able to retain the necessity for oral transmission in a very compelling way. And the process of reconciling the apparent contradictions, should we take care of the tires first or the fluid first at the gas station, right? The necessity for the oral transmission was a compelling way, and the process of reconciling the apparent contradictions between the different Mishnayos and other fillings in of the blanks remained oral. This included the understanding of the brises as they fit into the Mishnah.
What's brises?
The brises were written at the same, were taught at the same time as the Mishnah, but Yehuda Nasi, Yehuda the prince, right, was the final decisor of what would go into the Mishnah.
What is brisa? What brisa?
I'm coming to it. I'm coming to it, right? Some of the things he felt were not required to be part of the Mishnah. Not that they weren't true, but they weren't significant enough, or they were not complete enough. and he didn't include them in the Mishnah. They were called brises, and they are usually attached, because they weren't forgotten, they're usually attached in Gemaras or in Mishnayos. Right? Many years ago, I did a film, and in the film there was a fellow who was a professor in Ottawa, and he was an officer, he was a colonel in the KGB. He had a uniform in his closet of the colonel of the KGB. Right? And we were doing a film about Soviet influence in Canada. Right? And he was also one of the senior negotiators for NATO on behalf of NATO. He's a Canadian. On behalf of NATO, negotiating international water rights for Norway, for NATO, because the Soviets were very interested in, they had submarines going in and out of them, right? He was on both sides of the table, literally. In fact, he was on the Soviet side. Right? And in the process of making the film, it became clearer and clearer who he was. When it came time to make, he's in jail, by the way, in England for the rest of his life today. Yeah. When it came time to release the film, we showed the edited version to the head of CTV News, and he said, David, it's great, but we only have 27 minutes, right? Just give me your two best proofs of who he is, right? The rest of it, put in your briefcase and save for the lawyers. When the lawsuit comes, we'll need it. The brises are what's in the briefcase, right? It's not that they're not true. It's not that they're not important. It's not that it's because they weren't the single most important view on any given subject, right? So they accompany the Mishnah today, right? When we learn the Mishnah, this includes the understanding of the brises as they fit in with the Mishnayos. Although brises were not included in the organized order of the Mishnah, they nonetheless represent true opinions that must be reckoned with. They can be likened to sections of a rough draft of a book, which were omitted in the final published edition for various reasons, but not because they are not true. That's the brises, and you'll hear people refer to brises. This manner of learning continued for a few hundred years, right? So we're now really at the destruction of the temple, which is in our calendar 1, very close to 180 or 50 AD. And over the next 300 years, they continue to learn examples of how the Mishnah plays out. So when you look at a Gemara, it always starts with a Mishnah, right? 3 lines of a Mishnah. Some Mishnahs have no Gemara. Pirkei Avos has no Gemara attached to it at all, right? But most Mishnayos have connected to it today a Gemara, and the Gemara illustrates what the conversations were, right? So if you go back to the story of the gas station, now instead of having just the note that says go to the gas station, we have, David Ostriker said when you're at the gas station you should do this. And Galia Bendelman said when you get to the gas station you should do this, right? And Olga said you should do this, right? So it has the whole list, right? All of them, by the way, notice, are correct, right? So we have a problem because we have a lot of different ways of doing things and they're all correct, right? Shammai said on the first night of Hanukkah, light 8 candles. On the second night, light 7. On the third night, light 6. Hillel said on the first night, light 1. And they have very good reasons and very good proofs for why it should be in each case. Halachically, all you're required to do is light 1 candle each night, in fact. And, everything else is an embellishment beyond that. Mahadran. This manner of learning continued for a few hundred years until the time of Rav Ashi, who saw that it too was no longer sufficient, and he committed all the discussions surrounding the Mishnahs to writing. Right? These are the words of the Gemara or the Talmud Bavli that we have today. Its words are a written record of many discussions which span several generations, all aimed at understanding the oral tradition. Again, in order to maintain the oral element of the Gemara, its words are often cryptic and seemingly incomplete, making it necessary for one to learn from a Rebbe, linking him to the chain that connects all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. Following this was the area of the Gaonim. Alright, so let me just get a little reference here for you so that I can give you a couple of dates in this process. Where are my other notes? Okay, got it. Here we go. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So, just to give you a sense, okay, so Moshe received on Har Sinai in the year 2448 from creation. Right? Between 2448, which includes Moshe, includes the first temple, the Exodus, the Galus and Babel, and the beginning of the second temple, there were 1,000 years, up to it would have to be
Second temple.
3448, up to 3448, right? Which was about 50 years into the second temple, right? During that time, we went all the way from Moshe to the final prophets, right? There were prophets in Babel still, right? And there were prophets when the second temple was built, but those were the last of the prophets, right? Over the next 420 years, during the second temple period, it included the different exiles, which included the Purim story, included the Hanukkah story, and took us right up to Herod, and eventually the destruction of the second temple. So this would have taken us, the teachers of that time were originally the men of the Anshe Knesset, Gedolah. This was called the Men of the Great Assembly. The Men of the Great Assembly included people with whom you're familiar. Mordechai, Ezra, the Sofer, Nehemiah, Haggai, the prophet. It was men of not just brilliance,
They're not contemporary.
What?
They're not contemporary. It's a span
It
of
continued
couple of
for a period of time. The men of the Great Assembly were also the people who put together our Shemon Esrei. They were also the people who finalized what Tanakh was. Right? There were many discussions about what should be in the canon of Jewish scripture. Right?
What period is it? Can you repeat it, please?
The men of the Great Assembly ended. Hang on for a second.
For the second temple already?
Yeah. It came to an end during the period of the Tanoim, which was really at the destruction of the second temple, was the end.
Sinai.
Yeah. Or at the beginning of the Tannaim, I'm sure at the beginning of the Tannaim, which was around the year 0. Right?
What is the year?
The Tana are up there in the center.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you said Babylonian, it was as well?
What? So they were the responsible. For instance, there were 2 volumes that were a very big question as to whether they would be part of Jewish scripture. One was the Song of Songs, right, by Shlomo HaMelech. There was an argument that it was too erotic, that it didn't belong in scripture. Rabbi Akiva won the day in the discussions because he was able to prove that it's really about the relationship between God and Israel, as opposed to just between Shlomo and a woman. Right? And it stayed in the canon. The book of Ezekiel was a big question, because there are many things in Ezekiel that seem to be in conflict with the Chumash. And there was a question whether it should be included in the book. The Men of the Great Assembly included both of those, but there's a very famous book that they didn't include, the book of the Maccabees. The history of the Hanukkah Wars are not in the Jewish canon. They're not part of Tanakh. And in fact, they are part of Christian canon. They are part of the Christian Bible. And it wasn't included.
But sometimes they refer to books of Maccabees.
What?
Sometimes
We
they
do. We still know it. It's still out.
We have the book is available.
What's the difference
The book
between
is valid.
canon and
But-
the canonized thing and something which we have books?
How we can know that the book that we're reading, it's a Jewish book, the original one, and not Christian? Because a couple of times I found it on internet,
So
and after a couple of
Yeah.
pages, I understood what I'm reading.
So okay,
And
so
I'm
it's-
the wrong one.
yeah. So it's a very good question, right? And you really have to know it by who the publishers are more than anything else, because Genesis is in both Bibles,
Yeah.
right? We call it Torah, they call it the Old Testament, right? Well, everything that is in our scripture is also in their scripture. Everything, right? The prophets, the writings, it's all part of their scripture. Plus they have their own
a little bit
things,
twist.
right? They have their own translations, which are consistent with their own theology, right? But the fact of the matter is that if you were to read a Hebrew version of those books that they have, right, they would match our Hebrew version. It's just in translation. In Daniel, they refer to Mashiach by the founder of their faith, by name, actually. It's very peculiar, right? Translations often can be quite misleading. You have to be careful with it, and you have to know where the translation comes from.
If I'm going to Jewish store, to kosher Jewish store, and I can ask for a book of Maccabees, they will have it?
They may, but they probably won't. They probably won't, because it's not part of Jewish canon. It's not part. It was not accepted as part of
Who wrote
Tanakh.
it?
What?
Who wrote the...
It's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head who wrote it.
So how we can
Yeah.
get this book?
The book is available. It's a scholarly work, and you can get it, right? You can get it.
Just to make sure that it's the kosher publisher.
Yeah. You want to make sure that it is not part of another faith's perspective, right? But if you can you can either get it in Hebrew or you can get an accurate English translation. They exist. Information in the Gemara is spread all the way across it, and it's a huge work of information, very hard to master. Some people did, but it wasn't easy. So let's say you have a question. What time should I light my candles on Shabbos? That's my question, right? When I look under brachas, it tells me one place. When I look under Shabbos, it tells me another thing, right? When I look under, this issue of when is candle lighting time can appear in 5 or 6 different places in the Gemara, right? I only learned Shabbos, so I hold that that's the way to do it, right? But it turns out some people say it's 18 minutes, some people say it's 40 minutes, some people say you should light after dark, some people say you should light, before the sun goes down when the sky is light. Many debates, right? What the Rif said was, instead of having this spread all the way, I am now going to organize the subject matter dependent on its content and not dependent on the speakers or the thoughts they have. I'm going to take from every place in the Gemara the subject of candle lighting. And I'm going to put it in one section of my book, and I'm going to tell you what I think the correct resolution of this issue is. A very practical guide. Right? That's what he did.
But it's his idea.
The Rif, it seems, was the first person to begin to organize the information this way.
And coming to conclusion for everybody else.
To his conclusion.
Yeah, he wasn't firm on his conclusion, but he eliminated a lot of the talk back and forth. Right?
And I can imagine how the war it was between the rabbis.
How the what?
How it's war was.
It's exactly the right word. Right? It's called the War of the Gemara.
No, not war. It's war. War between rabbis to give him opportunity to conclude it. Not just my imagination.
You mean the permission for him to do it?
No. To give him permission.
He was a very lofty person. He was a person who had tremendous amount of respect. But by the way, obviously it wasn't the last word. Right? Now, the last word came from the Rambam. Look what it says here. Maimonides, Rambam, lived around the same time. He was actually, his father was a student of the Rif. Right? So he was like the grandson of the Rif from point of view of learning. Right? The Rambam, also around the same time, meaning within the same 100 years, took it upon himself to codify every halacha, including those pertaining to taharas and korbanos. These were not actually so important at that point because these were issues that had to do with purity in terms of the temple. Whether you could go to the temple, whether you could bring a sacrifice in the temple, and korbanos. And there was no temple. But Rambam said, I'm going to organize everything here.
When somebody says the word codify, what does it mean actually?
It means to put it in an order, a proper order. Okay. Yeah. When you go to a library, the Dewey Decimal System codifies the books, right? Anyway, it used to. I don't know how to do it now. Sign of my age. The Rambam, also around the same time, took it upon himself to codify every halacha, including those pertaining to taharas and korbanos sacrifices, that were relevant only when the temple stood. When he wrote his magnum opus, Yad HaHazacha, right, he claimed that it was to be the last of all such works and the bottom line of halacha for all of us to know. So that's all we can stop now. There's nothing else to learn, right? Learn the Rambam, you're finished. This is somewhat of an irony. Since the Rambam didn't cite his sources, the Yad HaZaka has been a bigger impetus for more Svarim to explain it than any other single work in history. He said it would be the last one. It actually caused more books to be written than any other book in Jewish history.
People were searching for sources to
and they're trying to explain how the Rambam came to this. Right?
And it's applicable to 13th principle of faith?
No, halachas.
Halachas.
Yeah, when the Rambam says this is when Shabbos starts, you don't need any other books. People were saying, well, where did he get? I mean, we know he's very smart, but how did he come to that, right? So, the next stage, right, of the Rishonim, of the early ones, was the Rosh and the Ran, right, who wrote their works according to the order of the Talmud, citing the major opinions of their predecessors and adding their own interpretations and additional understandings throughout. They're trying to make a practical document for a person to live their life. The Rosh, remember this name, the Rosh, the head, was the son of Rabbeinu Yaakov.
Not
What?
Had a son.
The Rosh had a son, Rabbeinu Yaakov, right, who saw a problem and decided to fix it. In order to properly make a halachic decision, a Rav must be fully aware of all the relevant sugyas, discussions of the Talmud, as they apply in his case. Since many of them are scattered in different tractates, so the Rif had begun this. Now the son of the Rosh really organizes it very well. As they apply in all cases, since many of them are scattered in different tractates, one must be fully aware of all of them and their whereabouts. As the time went by, the ability to have a full grasp of Shas, of the Talmud, became diminished. To rectify this, Rabbeinu Yaakov compiled the Torah, which was divided into 4 parts. Torah means row. You know, when you're plowing a field, right? You plow a straight line, right? So that's what he was doing. He was creating rows, right? What?
Barazda.
Row.
Ряд.
Tur.
So the Torah, as he became known, right? Since many of them are scattered. Okay, so to rectify this, Rabbeinu Yaakov compiled the Torah, which is divided into 4 parts, right? The Orach Chaim, dealing with the laws of daily life in the order of the day and the calendar. Morning halachas relating to food, Mincha, Shabbos, Yom Tov, Pesach, Shavuos. So what he did was, in this section, and this is the one we're most all familiar with, right, is he said, I'm going to set out the Jewish day, right? In the morning you get up, you say Modeh Ani, and you wash your hands, right? And then after that, and it goes through what you do all day long, right? That takes care of the day. And he said, now I'm going to tell you about the calendar. Separate thing, right? Starting with Rosh Hashanah, starting with Pesach, right? And go through everything that happens in the calendar year. That's one section of the Shulchan Aruch called the Orach Chaim. Okay?
Which means?
Orach Chaim...
Light of life?
Как Орах это... Как путь жизни.
Path of the life?
Path of the life, да. Орах это от слова ларух, это как накрывание жизни. Такое Шулхан Арух, Орах, it's the same.
It's like covering the life.
Covering
the life.
Yeah.
Covering the life. Yeah, like the topic. We're covering topic, yeah?
Right. The next row, the next section, right? It's called Yoredeah, right? Yoredeah addresses the halachas that are important for Rabbanim and Poskim, such as those dealing with Shechita, Kashrus, also Shabbos, Hagim, stuff like that. This is where I got my smicha in this area, right? So that I can answer in more detailed questions that a person has in really the same areas of Orach Chaim. In many ways, it's similar to that. But I have a better knowledge of the history of it and where to look to find the answers, right? So this was for Rabbanim mostly to answer those questions. The next row, Choshen Mishpat, right, deals with business matters, right? In Toronto, there are 3 Beis Dins, right? There's one Beis Din which takes care of Geras, people who want to convert. The same Beis Din is involved with tort law, with any kind of civil law, which is a question of Shmuel and Reuven disagree on the ownership of something. Their partner is a money thing. This is Choshen Mishpat, and this falls into their category as well, right? There is a third Beis Din which actually deals with Even HaEzer, right? Each of these are specialties, right? I'm not qualified to sit on the last 2 Beis Dins. I don't have enough knowledge to do it, right? Even HaEzer deals primarily with matters of marriage and divorce, right? And divorce being the most sensitive one. In Toronto, that's a separate Beis Din, run by Rabbi Ox. Right?
Камень помощи. Камень помощи.
Even Ezer? The Ezer?
Yeah. Even HaEzer, right? So this is what the Code of Jewish Law is made up of, really, is these 4 things. We're going to come to how it works out. In his work, Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal HaTurim, right, the master of the rows, as he became known, quotes the Gemaras as they deal with each issue, citing the major opinions of the Rishonim regarding each halacha. It was a tremendous work. It revolutionized the understanding.
It wasn't the end still.
No. Short time later, now we're going to names we're familiar with. Rabbi Yosef Karo of Spain, who settled in Sfat. Rabbi Yosef Karo was a great Kabbalist as well as halachist, right? He was inspired to compile a masterwork called the Beis Yosef, the House of Yosef. Yosef Karo has many different names. He's Yosef Karo, he's called the Mechaber, he's called the Beis Yosef. It's all the same person, right?
Oh, he's Mechaber.
Right. Yeah, he's a Mechaber, in which he discusses in Beis Yosef each Gemara and the opinions of the Rishonim at length. He later codified all this in the Shulchan Aruch, literally the set table. That's what Shulchan Aruch means, the set table, right? So he took the Beis Yosef, which was, maybe about half the size of the Gemara, but organized by subject matter, and realized this is still too cumbersome, right? And he squeezed it down into 4 volumes of the Shulchan Aruch, which was consistent with what the Baal HaTurim had done as well, right? And they worked, in some ways they had much in common. Very often the Tour's work appears in a Shulchan Aruch as well, in the back of it, right? Because it precedes the Shulchan Aruch, right? As a rule, the Beis Yosef always decided the halacha, this is very important, based on the majority opinion of 3 people: the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. What did he do? He went to people who had distilled the ideas of their predecessors, right? And distilled their ideas. Right? That's what he did. Right? Now, by the way, at the time that the Shulchan Aruch was published, right, there was a lot of dispute about it because his rabbis won't have to learn Gemara anymore. They'll just learn the end product of it. And they should have this chain taking them back.
But he's
right?
mentioning 3 previous one too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, what he did was he decided the majority of the Rif. Now remember, the fix is in here a little bit, right? Because the Rif and the Rambam, both Sephardim, and actually the Rambam's father learns from the Rif, and the Rambam learns from his father, right? So those 2 opinions are going to be very similar, and the third opinion is the opinion of the Rosh, who is European, right, and represents the Ashkenaz, right? But in the end, the majority of the views of the Mechaber are consistent with the way Sephardim hold, right? As a rule, the Beis Yosef always decided halacha based on the majority opinion of the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, the first 2 of which were Sephardim. This was not sufficient for Reb Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, who followed the Ashkenazi tradition, he lived in Poland, that considered Tosafos as the major determining factor of halacha. Remember, go back, we learned about Rashi and Tosafos, right? So they were French, right? Incorporating the opinions of the customs.
They were Ashkenazic French.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Also including the customs of the Maharam Rothenberg, who is German, and the Maharel as well, right? So that trying to get through here, we may succeed. Tell a quick story, right? So when the Yosef Karo finished the Shulchan Aruch, right, he sent a copy to the Ramah in Poland. The Ramah was finishing his version of the Shulchan Aruch, and he looked, and he said, "This work is brilliant. It's brilliant, right? But it only applies. It only applies to the Sephardim. There are many places where we hold differently, right? So I'm going to make notes here where we differ from the way you do it, right?" And he sent it back to Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo was so moved, A, that he didn't publish his own competitively, and B, that he respected the work that he had done, that he said, when I publish this, I'm going to include all the notes of the Ramah, right? And when you look at a Shulchan Aruch, you see the work of the Mechaber, Yosef Karo, right? And in a different typeface, the words of the Ramah. So an Ashkenaz looks at it and says, okay, this is where we differ. If there's no comment from the Ramah, then we in the Ashkenaz we in the Sephardim hold the same. If there is a difference, we have a note from the Ramah. This is how we do it. Right? At the end, Yosef Karo was so moved by this, he sat down and he wrote a Sefer Torah and sent it as a gift to the Ramah. At the end.
It's very elegant relationship. It's much better
and he
than
commented that the Ramah called his work the Mapam, which means the tablecloth. And Rabbi Yosef Karo said it's the first time that the tablecloth was completed before the table. Right? Was his comment. So that's really the story of how we came to the Shulchan Aruch. Right? It's the combination of these two things. Right? So I'm going to skip down to the bottom of the page. However, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah performed a great service for Klal Yisrael. Their works did not discuss their works did not discuss every possible situation and set of circumstances. This became the job of the following generations: the Taz, the Magen Avraham, the Shach. Now what they're trying to do is not, remember, all the way through this, nobody's trying to create halachas. They're trying to tell you what the halacha was that Moshe Sinai had and came all the way down, how it applies to, what does it mean if I'm taking an ocean cruise? Right? There was no ocean cruise for Moshe Sinai, but what he said applies to an ocean cruise, Shabbos on an ocean cruise. But how does it apply? We have to break our heads to understand it. Now we have electric wheelchairs we're dealing with on Shabbos, right? We have a refrigerator, we have a freezer, all kinds of things that the Torah does anticipate, because the Torah is by God and it's infinite. But man has to figure out how he anticipated it. The Torah is given here, now. It's our job to do it. That's what everybody has been doing ever since that time. This became, by the way, the Taz, I believe, or the Shach, was the son-in-law of the Ramah. Right? So they were working to explain the Shulchan Aruch. Right? Later commentaries often argued, questioned, clarified their words, which were sometimes cryptic and at times replete with copyist errors. So this was one of the problems. Unlike the early days where there were no mistakes because the oral tradition had no broken telephone, once they started printing things, there were mistakes made. I'll give you a very common example. You're not allowed to have meat and milk together, right? It's forbidden to mix them together, right? This is called basar b'chalav, meat and milk. Meat is basar, milk is chalav. It's forbidden to have them together, right? There's another word which has virtually the same consonants in it called chalev. Chalev are the organ fats in an animal. They are also forbidden to be eaten. They're supposed to be burned on the mizbeach. If you're the printer and you look at the written word, right, they both have the same consonants, it becomes your job to figure out what the vowels are. Right? Lots of mistakes were made. Right? They're copyist errors. So that needed to be worked on and corrected constantly. They were correcting typos, basically, at this point.
It's like Israeli, they read without
yeah.
Nikudot because they know what word would mean.
And many things, the Torah is without Nikudot. Many things are without
because
Nikudot.
People know.
Because they know, yeah. If you...
But sometimes if there is something like you mentioned,
right.
you can see the entire page without, but something with the Nikudot.
If it's not clear, the person
right.
will put Nikudot.
That's right. And if you think about it, you can read a whole page of a book without vowels and know what it means. You won't have a problem with it.
Sometimes it's a joke people do it.
Yeah, and you can do it, right? But you can make a big mistake, too. Right? During that period, an enormous amount of responses were written. Responses are letters that are written. What used to happen in the most ancient days is a phrase called Yarchei Kala. I don't know if any of you ever heard it. It's a time when people get together. Now they do it usually between December 25th and January 1st, when a lot of Jews are off work because businesses are closed. So they come to shuls and they learn for that week. Right? There was a tradition during the months of Elul and Adar, which were the months in which things were growing in the field but hadn't been harvested yet. Right? So there wasn't much for people to do, so they would all come, they would send their rebbeim to Bavel, to the great yeshivas in Babylon. And those yeshivas stood for 1,000 years, long after the return to Israel. And they would send from Europe to those yeshivas. Any questions they had, their rabbis would learn for those 2 months and then come back to their shuls with the answers to their questions, right? Now we do it, ask the rabbi, by the internet. But it was the same idea, but it was a lot slower process. Right? The last 150 years has seen the publication of many Kitzur Svarim, or mini Shulchan Aruchs, right? And everybody should have one in their home. Many great poskim have taken upon themselves to once again condense the halacha so the average layman could read it and know what to do. Among the more famous works are the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. That's very popular, right? The Shulchan Aruch Harav. That is the remainder of the work of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidus. He wrote a halachic work, his own Shulchan Aruch, called the Shulchan Aruch of the Rav. Unfortunately, much of it was lost because of the persecutions that Chabad and the Alter Rebbe suffered. It was destroyed by enemies at one time or another. Also, the work of the Chayadim, who is this book here. The earlier part of the last century saw the publication of the Aruch HaShulchan, the Mishnah Berurah. The Aruch HaShulchan it's a very interesting book. It actually takes whatever the law is and traces each law back all the way back to the Gemara, right? So it's like an etymology of the law. If you're curious, it's a very interesting thing, and you can see how each law flowed back to it, right?
It's a mental exercise periodically to understand how
it's not just a mental exercise. It's, again, this connection back, all the way back to Har Sinai, right? The Mishnah Berurah was written by the Chofetz Chaim. Chofetz Chaim, to many people, is most famous for his laws of speech, of avoiding Lashon Hara, right? But in the halachic world, he's most famous for this. It is on a par, and in many places favored over the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch as a book to work from. And it is, again, it has this purpose of condensing the laws. The Mishnah Berurah is divided into 3 sections. Mishnah Berurah is the main part of the work. In it, the author, most commonly referred to as the Chofetz Chaim, explains the elaborate words of the Shulchan Aruch and elaborates on the words of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, often citing other major opinions and rulings of them to follow. In somewhat a footnote style, at the bottom of each page is the Shar HaTziyun, gates of inwardness, kind of, where he often cites the sources, sometimes adding new ideas and comments. His accompanying work, the Biur Halacha, is a lengthy discussion of many issues that are germane to the topic at hand. It is often an intricate discussion of the sugya, the topic of the Gemara and the Rishonim.
It means it's adding. Here we can see, obviously, it's a person adding his own...
Well, there is addition required always because circumstances change. Not because of Torah, but how do we apply the Torah to new circumstances? That's the constant issue, right? You know, how do we not change the Torah, but what was God's intent at Har Sinai to deal with this today?
Like microwave,
right.
for example. Or train.
Yeah, right. Is microwave cooking, right? It's a question, right? There's no fire, right? So, or LED lights versus tungsten lights. Tungsten lights.
I can use
right?
so I can use it in Shabbat.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
You say it's not fire.
But the violation of Shabbos is not. Many people would say, right? It's not a Torah violation of Shabbos. It could be a rabbinic violation. There's 2 different things. Whether it's a Torah violation or it's a fence around that violation, which makes it into a rabbinic violation. Shouldn't violate either one. Because what does the Torah say? That you should listen to the judge, you should listen to the Kohen of your time. That's a Torah requirement to pay attention to that.
Meat.
What?
So chicken, this is a meat.
Exactly. That's exactly right. There's a very long discussion to it, right?
Plus there is Marit Ayin.
Plus there's Maris Ayin, but Maris Ayin is largely rabbinic. The reason chicken is meat, right, is because duck looks like meat. So if you came to my home, right, and I had a glass of milk and duck, you might conclude from that, because you don't know it's duck when you're looking at it, or you see me in a cafe eating a piece of duck and drinking milk, you might conclude, okay, he looks like a rabbi and he's eating meat and milk, I guess it's okay, right? That's called Maris Ayin, right? And for that reason, it's a long discussion, but for that reason, we hold that you don't have that fowl, that chicken, is included in meet, so that we don't make this mistake. And I'll show you at some time in the future where there are leniencies that involve that. Right? It's highly different. Okay, the world is changing the place, and each period of history presents its own unique set of issues and circumstances. Torah does not change, but a competent posek, halachic authority, must know how to apply the eternal words of Torah to each issue or question, given its unique set of circumstances. It is for this reason that one must have a connection to a Rebbe. Although one may pose a question to any qualified Rav and then rely on his answer, this may not be the best answer suitable for him. If I'm asked a question by you, I might give you a different answer than I might give Galia, right? It depends on when it's asked, what the circumstances are. There is a spectrum of answers given. A Rav is familiar with the person asking and can appreciate his or her unique set of circumstances, may respond slightly differently. Cut and dry halacha is good for the world of print, but the living halacha exists only by connecting to a link in the chain. It's a very, very important idea. The intent of this work is not to decide, this work that we're reading here, that's an introduction to, not to decide for its reader, although by relying on the information contained within one can satisfy his obligation, he is nevertheless lacking in the connection. The purpose of these pages is to serve as a guideline to give direction about what to do and to make the reader know when to ask. This itself is important. On more than one occasion, I have witnessed people posing questions about a subject that is completely a matter of custom, of minhag, with the gravity of a question of life and death. Let me read that one more time. Okay. A Jew must be aware of the issues and at times be able to decide for himself, but must always maintain the connection back to Har Sinai. Knowing when he can decide on his own and which decisions to make is crucial. This is the intent of the coming pages.